Please, not again. The words barely made it past her lips before her body folded in on itself, as if sound alone had unlocked something she had spent months holding shut. Inside the British medical tent, the air smelled of antiseptic and damp canvas, a sterile attempt to impose order on lives that had known none for a very long time. It was late 1945. The war was officially over. On paper, Europe was already moving on. But not here. A German female prisoner sat on a narrow hospital bed, her back turned toward the entrance, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She had learned that stillness attracted less attention. That silence was safer than explanation. She had survived long enough to know that compliance was not the same thing as safety, only the closest substitute available. When the British medic stepped behind her and reached out, his touch was careful, routine, almost gentle. Her scream was not. It tore through the tent with a force that froze everyone in place. Guards shifted instinctively. Other prisoners looked away. The sound carried something older than pain, something deeper than fear in the moment. It carried memory. In that single second, the machinery of post-war order hesitated. What happened next was not written into any manual. It was not part of camp procedure. No regulation required it. And yet, that pause, that choice to stop, would quietly outlast uniforms, fences, and even the war itself. This story is not about a battle. It is not about victory or defeat. It is about what remains in the human body after violence ends, and how easily healing can be delayed or begun by the smallest act. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Every day, we uncover moments history nearly lost. This is the story of a scream in a medical tent, and the silence that followed. By the autumn of 1945, Europe existed in a strange suspended state, neither at war nor truly at peace. The gunfire had stopped, the borders had been redrawn, and the headlines had already begun speaking in the language of rebuilding. But on the ground, the war still clung to everything. It lingered in the rubble of cities, in the ration lines, and in the way people flinched at sudden sounds. The British occupation zone was a landscape of improvisation. Camps appeared almost overnight, stitched together from canvas, timber, and whatever materials could be scavenged. These were not prisons in the old sense, but they were not places of freedom either. They were holding spaces, designed to manage the sheer human volume left behind when an army collapsed. Millions of people had surrendered in the final weeks. Some had thrown down their weapons. Others had simply stopped moving forward. The administrative task of sorting, feeding, housing, and documenting them was immense, and it fell to military systems that were already exhausted. Efficiency became the priority. Individual stories rarely fit into the forms. Inside the camps, days blurred together. Roll calls at dawn. Work details assigned to keep the machinery running. Meals that were thin but regular, a small mercy compared to the chaos of the final months of fighting. Guards rotated in and out, many of them barely older than the prisoners they watched, all carrying their own versions of what the war had taken from them. Medical tents were among the busiest spaces. Prisoners arrived with injuries sustained during retreat, surrender, or transport. Bruises from overcrowded trucks. Infections left untreated for weeks. Chronic exhaustion that no bandage could fix. The examinations were meant to be quick. Triage, not therapy. For many prisoners, medical contact was their first close interaction with Allied personnel that did not involve orders or weapons. For some, it was also the first time they had been touched by someone in uniform who was not shouting, striking, or demanding something in return. That contrast alone was enough to unsettle nerves already stretched thin. German female prisoners occupied an especially uneasy place in this environment. Their wartime roles varied widely, from clerical and communications work to auxiliary service attached to combat units. In the final year of the war, distinctions had collapsed. Everyone had been pulled closer to the front, closer to danger, closer to situations no training had prepared them for. After surrender, they were processed the same way as everyone else. Names, numbers, categories. The system did not ask what they had endured, only where they fit. Trauma was not a column on any form. The camps themselves reflected this mindset. They were functional spaces, not humane ones. Privacy was minimal. Conversations were overheard whether you wanted them to be or not. Even rest felt conditional, something that could be interrupted at any moment by a whistle or a shouted command. In this atmosphere, the body learned faster than the mind. It learned when to stay still, when to look down, when to tense in anticipation of touch. Survival instincts hardened into habits that no longer required conscious thought. For prisoners like Annalisa, the war had not ended with surrender. It had simply changed shape. The violence was no longer constant or explosive, but the loss of control remained. Decisions were still made elsewhere. Time still belonged to someone else. The medical tent was meant to be neutral ground, a place where the rules softened slightly in the presence of illness or injury. But neutrality is fragile when fear has been rehearsed too many times. A gentle hand could still feel like a threat. A routine examination could awaken memories the conscious mind kept buried. This was the world into which Annalisa stepped that morning. A world trying to organize itself after catastrophe, using systems built for order to contain lives shaped by chaos. A world where kindness was not forbidden, but neither was it guaranteed. What happened inside that tent did not occur in isolation. It was shaped by everything that came before it, and it would quietly shape everything that came after. Not because it was dramatic, but because it broke the pattern, just briefly, in a place where patterns ruled survival. Before she was a prisoner, before she was a number on a form clipped to a clipboard, Annalisa had been an ordinary young woman living inside a country that was running out of options. By the time her name appeared on a conscription list in late 1944, the war had already narrowed life into a series of compromises. Food was scarce. Trains ran irregularly. Air raid sirens had become part of the daily rhythm, like church bells once had. She had not volunteered. Very few women did by that point. She was assigned to a women's auxiliary unit attached to a communications post, trained quickly and inadequately, then sent west as the front lines shifted closer every week. Her work was technical and repetitive, relaying messages, maintaining equipment, following orders that grew more frantic as the situation deteriorated. The retreat began quietly and then all at once. What had been structured movements turned into hurried evacuations. Vehicles overloaded. Roads clogged with soldiers, refugees, carts, livestock. Command posts moved overnight, sometimes without warning. Radios went silent for reasons no one could explain. Familiar faces disappeared, sometimes reappearing days later, sometimes not at all. In those months, Annalisa learned to observe without reacting. Panic wasted energy. Questions drew attention. She followed instructions when they were given and followed instinct when they were not. The war no longer resembled anything she had been trained for. It was improvisation layered on top of fear. The final weeks before surrender blurred together. Air raids came without warning. Sleep arrived in fragments. Rumors spread faster than information. Some units dissolved entirely, their members scattering in small groups, hoping to avoid capture by moving west instead of east. Annalisa was caught during one of these movements. There was no dramatic confrontation. No last stand. Just exhaustion meeting inevitability. Weapons were discarded. Hands were raised. Orders were shouted in a language she only partially understood. From that point on, time lost its familiar shape. There were holding areas, transfers, long waits punctuated by sudden movement. She was searched, questioned briefly, searched again. The process was impersonal and relentless. She complied because compliance had become reflex. Resistance no longer felt like courage. It felt dangerous. What happened during that period was not something she would later describe in detail. Not because she forgot, but because remembering served no purpose. The body remembered enough for both of them. It remembered unpredictability. It remembered hands appearing without warning. It remembered the cost of being noticed. By the time she arrived at the British camp, silence had become her shield. She answered questions when required, nodded when instructed, and avoided eye contact whenever possible. The less she registered as an individual, the safer she felt. The transport that brought her in arrived before dawn. Dozens of women packed tightly together, bodies pressed against bodies, no room to shift or stretch. Some whispered. Others stared straight ahead. Annalisa did neither. She focused on staying upright, on keeping her breathing steady, on enduring. The camp intake was efficient. Names checked. Belongings inventoried. Numbers assigned. Each step reinforced the same message. You are here now. This is how it works. The medical tent was just another station in that sequence. Another place where strangers would look at her body and make decisions she had no control over. She expected discomfort. She expected indifference. She expected to endure it the same way she had endured everything else. What she did not expect was the way her body would betray her. The reaction came before thought, before memory, before reason. A scream pulled from somewhere deeper than conscious fear. A collapse she could not stop. In that instant, months of restraint gave way to something raw and uncontained. It was not defiance. It was not weakness. It was the accumulated weight of everything she had not been allowed to react to when it happened. Annalisa had survived by becoming smaller, quieter, less visible. The scream shattered that carefully constructed shell. And once it cracked, she could not immediately put it back together. She did not know yet that this moment would mark a boundary. That before it, the war still lived entirely inside her body, unchallenged and unquestioned. And that after it, however slowly, something else might begin to take root. Not healing. Not peace. But the possibility that fear did not have to dictate every movement forever. Thomas Whitmore had stopped counting the wounded long before the war stopped producing them. By 1945, numbers blurred together, useful only for reports and requisitions. What stayed with him were faces, moments, and the quiet decisions that never made it into official records. He enlisted in 1941, not out of romantic notions of service, but because medicine felt like the only way he knew how to be useful in a world coming apart. He trained in a military hospital in Kent, learning to work quickly, to prioritize, to accept that saving one life sometimes meant letting another go. By the time he was shipped overseas, hesitation had been trained out of him. North Africa was his real education. Heat, sand, and injuries that arrived faster than supplies. Men brought in with wounds that should have killed them and others who looked intact but faded within hours. There was no time for reflection. Only action. Only the next patient. Italy followed. Then France. Each campaign added another layer of experience, another set of habits designed to keep him functioning. He learned to build emotional distance not because he lacked compassion, but because proximity to suffering without boundaries was unsustainable. You did your job. You moved on. You slept when you could. By the time Germany surrendered, Thomas felt older than his years. The battlefield was gone, replaced by camps, paperwork, and the long, quiet aftermath of a war that refused to end cleanly. The injuries he saw now were different. Fewer shrapnel wounds. More exhaustion. More bodies carrying damage that did not show up on X-rays or charts. Post-war medical work required a different kind of patience. Prisoners were not grateful patients. Many did not trust him. Some barely spoke. Others flinched at the sight of his uniform. He understood that instinctively. Trust had been weaponized for years. Still, procedure remained procedure. Intake examinations were meant to be efficient. You checked for injuries. You noted symptoms. You moved the line forward. There were always more waiting. When Annalisa was brought in, nothing on the paperwork suggested anything unusual. Possible bruising. Transport fatigue. Routine. He approached her the way he approached everyone else, with deliberate calm and professional detachment. The scream shattered that distance. It was not the volume that struck him, but the quality of it. This was not pain reacting to pressure. It was fear reacting to memory. The kind that bypassed thought entirely. Thomas had seen men scream when shells landed too close, long after the guns had fallen silent. He recognized the pattern immediately. The body replaying something the mind could not yet face. What surprised him was his own reaction. Without thinking, he stepped back. Raised his hands. Told the guard to stop. The words came out sharper than he intended, edged with authority he did not often use. He realized, in that moment, that speed was the wrong tool. The war had trained him to act quickly. To fix what could be fixed and move on from what could not. But this was not a wound that responded to pressure or sutures. This was something else entirely. He spoke softly, explaining himself, narrating actions he had performed thousands of times without comment. His German was poor, but intention carried where fluency failed. He made himself visible. Slowed his movements. Waited. Waiting was harder than treating. Outside the tent, the camp continued its routines. Inside, time stretched. He was aware of the inefficiency, of the eyes on him, of the unspoken expectation that he restore order. But something in him refused. He remembered other moments from the war. Times when he had moved too quickly. When he had followed protocol at the expense of the person in front of him. Those decisions had been necessary then. They had also left marks he carried quietly. This time, he chose differently. He offered her choice. The simplest thing. The rarest. To his surprise, it worked. Not immediately. Not cleanly. But enough. As he conducted the examination, he realized how little the body actually needed from him. Bruises. No fractures. Fatigue that rest might ease. Medically, there was almost nothing to do. And yet, this was one of the most important moments of his service. Because for the first time since the war ended, he would carry that realization forward. though he did not yet know how long it would stay with him, or how quietly it would reshape the way he practiced medicine long after the uniforms were put away. From the outside, nothing about the medical tent suggested significance. Canvas walls sagged slightly under the weight of moisture. A single stove fought against the chill, its warmth uneven and unreliable. The light inside was flat and practical, designed to illuminate bodies, not moments. And yet, this was where everything slowed. Annalisa sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched forward, her breathing still uneven. The scream had taken something out of her, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. She kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards, as if looking up might invite the world back too quickly. Thomas did not move. He stood where she could see him if she chose to look. Hands open. Posture deliberately unthreatening. In the silence that followed, the usual hierarchy of the camp briefly dissolved. There was no prisoner and captor here, no schedule pressing in, no authority asserting itself. There was only a person who had been frightened beyond endurance and another who recognized it. He spoke again, quietly. Not instructions. Information. What he needed to check. Why? How long it would take. He told her what would happen before it happened, not because protocol demanded it, but because fear thrived in uncertainty. Annalisa listened without lifting her head. Words reached her slowly, filtered through adrenaline and fatigue. What registered was not their content so much as their tone. There was no urgency in his voice. No impatience. No warning of consequences. Choice hovered in the air, unfamiliar and fragile. When she nodded, it felt like a decision made with her entire body. She shifted slightly so she could see him. Needed to anchor herself to something solid. His face was tired. Older than she had expected. Not unkind. Not eager. Just present. He narrated each movement. Before touching her shoulder, he said so. Before examining her back, he explained where his hands would be. Each pause was an invitation rather than a command. The examination itself was ordinary. Bruises fading into yellow and green. Tenderness that would resolve with time. Nothing requiring intervention. But the ordinariness was the point. Her body was being handled without violence. Without demand. Around them, the tent remained quiet. Other prisoners waited. Guards watched, uncertain. The moment stretched, resisting the pace of everything outside it. Annalisa focused on details. The sound of fabric shifting. The faint creak of wood beneath boots that did not advance. The rhythm of her own breathing slowly returning to something she recognized. When it was over, Thomas stepped back again. Gave her space. Told her she was done. No rush. No dismissal. She remained seated for a moment, gathering herself. The urge to flee warred with the realization that she did not need to. Not here. Not now. This was not healing in the way stories often describe it. There was no release, no sudden sense of safety washing everything clean. The war had marked her too deeply for that. But something subtle had shifted. For the first time since capture, her body had reacted and been met not with force, but with restraint. Fear had surfaced and been acknowledged rather than punished. The pattern had been interrupted. Thomas felt it too, though differently. He was aware that medically he had done very little. No life-saving intervention. No decisive action. And yet, he sensed that this would stay with him longer than many of the moments that had once defined his service. When Annalisa eventually stood and followed the guard toward the exit, her movements were still cautious. Still controlled. But they were not quite as rigid as before. Neither of them looked back. The tent returned to its routine. Names called. Forms filled. Another patient stepped forward. The system resumed its rhythm as if nothing unusual had occurred. But for those few minutes, something rare had happened inside that canvas enclosure. A space had been created where fear did not dictate every outcome. Where dignity was not conditional. It was a small thing. Almost invisible in the vast accounting of the war. And yet, it would echo forward in ways neither of them could have predicted, carried quietly into lives still waiting to be rebuilt. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both numbing and oddly stabilizing. For Annalisa, the camp became a place of waiting rather than fear. The distinction mattered. Waiting implied an end point, even if it was undefined. Fear suggested permanence. She was assigned to laundry detail, work that was physically demanding but predictable. The heat of the washrooms, the repetition of folding and sorting, the constant smell of soap and damp fabric filled the hours and left little room for thought. In a world where unpredictability had been lethal, routine became its own form of relief. She did not speak often. When she did, it was measured. The scream in the medical tent was never mentioned again. Not by guards. Not by other prisoners. Not by her. Silence reclaimed its place, but it felt different now. Less like armor, more like choice. The memory of that moment stayed with her, surfacing at unexpected times. Not as an image, but as a sensation. The pause. The waiting. The realization that touch did not always demand endurance. That sometimes, it came with explanation and respect. Months passed. Paperwork moved slowly through channels that had been overwhelmed by the scale of defeat. Reviews were conducted. Classifications adjusted. Some prisoners were released sooner than others, depending on labor needs, records, and the availability of somewhere to send them. Annalisa watched women leave in small groups, carrying what little they owned, stepping into a country that barely resembled the one they had left behind. She waited her turn. When release finally came in early 1946, it was almost anticlimactic. A set of papers. Directions to a displaced persons center. A small sum of money. No ceremony. No acknowledgement of what had been endured. The journey home was slow. Trains were overcrowded or cancelled. Roads were broken. Cities appeared as silhouettes of themselves, walls standing where rooms once existed. When she reached her hometown, she found only fragments. Her family's apartment building was a shell. Windows gone. Stairwells exposed to the sky. She did not know where her parents were. Or her younger brother. Records were incomplete. Messages traveled slowly, if at all. Like so many others, she began again without answers. She found work in a restaurant kitchen, washing dishes and preparing food for people who were just as tired as she was. Later, she married a man who carried his own quiet losses. They spoke about the war rarely and vaguely, as if naming details might give them power again. Life moved forward in practical ways. Children were born. Routines formed. The past receded, not because it was resolved, but because there was no room for it in the work of survival. Thomas's life followed a different but parallel path. After demobilization, he returned to England and resumed his training. He settled into general practice in a small town, trading tents and triage for clinics and house calls. The injuries changed. Fewer explosions. More chronic pain. More unspoken grief. He found himself slowing down with patience. Explaining procedures he once would have performed without comment. Watching for hesitation, for flinches that suggested something unarticulated. He did not talk about the camp often, but the lessons traveled with him. In a journal he kept sporadically, he wrote once about a German prisoner in a medical tent who had taught him the difference between treatment and care. He did not record her name. Only the impact. Decades later, long after both of their lives had settled into shapes neither could have imagined in 1945, the memory remained intact. For Annalisa, it became a story she told her daughter once, framed not as trauma, but as a moment when the world stopped being entirely hostile. For Thomas, it remained a quiet reference point. A reminder to pause. To offer choice. To see the person before the symptom. They never knew of each other's futures. Never crossed paths again. History kept them separate. But the ripples from that brief encounter continued outward, shaping how each of them moved through the rest of their lives. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Just enough to matter. History often remembers wars through numbers. Casualties counted. Cities destroyed. Borders shifted. Those figures matter, but they leave out something essential. They leave out the small moments that never make it into archives, the ones that shape lives quietly and permanently. The medical tent in late 1945 was not a place meant for transformation. It was a functional space, designed to process bodies efficiently so that larger systems could move forward. And yet, within that narrow frame, something survived that the war had worked very hard to erase. Dignity. Not in grand gestures or heroic acts, but in restraint. In the decision to pause when everything else demanded speed. In the choice to treat fear as real rather than inconvenient. Annalisa did not leave the camp healed. Trauma does not resolve on command. It lingers in the body, resurfaces without warning, and reshapes ordinary experiences in ways that are difficult to explain to those who have not lived it. But she left with something else. A proof of concept. Evidence that the rules governing human interaction could change. That knowledge mattered more than comfort. It allowed her to move forward into a shattered country and begin the long, uneven work of rebuilding a life. She became a mother, then a grandmother. She baked, worked, worried, laughed. The war receded into the background of her days, present but no longer consuming every thought. When she spoke of it, she chose her moments carefully, offering fragments rather than full accounts. To those who knew her only in later years, she appeared strong, practical, and composed. Few would have guessed how hard-won that composure had been. Thomas, too, carried the moment forward. It informed how he practiced medicine long after uniforms and ranks were gone. He became known as a doctor who listened, who explained, who did not rush patients through fear. These were not qualities that earned medals, but they earned trust. When he died in the late 1980s, his family sorted through his belongings and found journals filled with brief entries. Dates. Observations. A few lines here and there about moments that had mattered to him. Among them was a reference to a German prisoner in a medical tent, unnamed but unforgettable. His granddaughter would read that passage decades later and pause, struck by the realization that her grandfather's life had been shaped not only by the dramatic events of war, but by a single choice to slow down. She would wonder about the woman in the tent. About whether she survived. About whether that moment had mattered to her too. She would never know the answer. And yet, that is how history often works. Lives intersect briefly, leaving marks that are never traced back to their source. Meaning travels without acknowledgement. Impact outlasts recognition. The war had created countless moments of cruelty. It had taught millions of people to expect the worst from one another. But it had not succeeded in erasing the capacity for something else. That is what survived. Not innocence. Not purity. But the ability to choose patience over force, recognition over efficiency, humanity over habit. If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe that history is shaped not only by battles but by the quiet decisions made in their aftermath, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more accounts like this, waiting to be remembered. Because sometimes, what changes everything is not what we do, but what we choose not to do.